Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to episode 4 of Behind the Screens. I hope everyone's having a good evening. It's just a little after 11 o'clock in the UK, and I've been thoroughly enjoying the Olympics. And even though it's a bit inconvenient for timing, but they did make sure the triathlons were at an absolutely superb time for me. So that was very kind of them. So, what have I got for you this evening? We're going to finish off the GMs Back Pocket, which essentially I've run out of all of the absolutely key things that I have to cover for the things that make a GM's life just easier. And there are, it turns out, only 3 episodes worth of that. I didn't know that, you understand, when I started, but it turns out there are only 3. So I've got just a couple more things to talk about on that tonight. This evening we're going to be covering how the world can be used to give you useful cues for when you're put on the spot, and the notion of maintaining a parallel life for your party. It's also the third and last part of the RPG storytelling series, which is kind of heavy. It's going to handle the way campaigns are structured. But don't panic too much, because all you really need to take from it is a couple of the terminology words that I'm going to be using. And the reason for doing that is because immediately afterwards, well, a few minutes afterwards, I'm going to start a completely new series under a different title, which will begin a worked example. So we'll actually go through and build a campaign from scratch. I'm going to be talking more about the ancient computer games that are out there, and TGPCITHOTU, which, if you remember from last week, is an acronym, not a Cthulhu villain. And I'm going to talk about another piece of software that was very instrumental and really led to quite significant changes and expansions in the way the concept of role-playing was played out on computer. I'm going to show you another piece of software, this time Dungeon Scroll. This is not a piece of software I use as much as RPG Map, but it's an absolutely cracking tool, and I think you might find it interesting as well. And along the way, I'm going to discuss the poetry of Robert Frost, the history of battleship design, and a little bit about Boustrophodon. Because I can't, for some reason, do anything without going through some little random diversions. I don't know, I think it's like a sickness that I have. Now, we are towards the end of our Summer of Love. So check out what's gone before on the VODs and what's still to come. And we're on Twitter at Boys Baltic for the latest updates. So on Thursday evening from 11, we are doing some Those Dark Places, which Luke is GMing for us, which is an enormous amount of fun. And we're looking forward to dying horribly on that. And then Friday, of course, will be our regular weekly Traveller game. And hopefully there will be some entertainment in that as well. Because I'm looking forward to we're coming to the end of one sort of phase of the game and moving into another. I don't know how far we'll get through, obviously, but I think there's a chance that we'll get into a new phase on Friday. We'll find out. It may be a week away. So this week is your last opportunity, thanks to Summer of Love, to win prizes from our stream, at least for a while, and your last opportunity to see the adverts we're carrying for creators we like in the community, at least for the time being, unless we change our minds, of course, which we might well do. We're like random kittens bouncing off the furniture. It's a mess, frankly. We don't run this as a very professional operation. So in terms of our official planned things, tonight is the anti-penultimate event for the Summer of Love. That's the third last. You didn't need to actually know that, but I never get to use the word anti-penultimate, so I'm choosing it tonight. So, welcome to the stream. Thank you for joining me, whether live or by VOD. As always, I'm very appreciative of any interest and any feedback you might have. So without further ado, it's probably time to begin. So, here we go. Part 3 of the things I think a GM has to have in their back pocket in order to make a game run smoothly. Or, obviously, it's not actually what a GM has to have, and everyone does it differently, and your way's probably better. But these are the things I do. We've actually covered the two main essentials already. The way I prepare a location in the game, and the way I control the pace, and even the direction as needed. But for this last part, I'm mainly going to be talking about things that I use but don't consider essential. Just really, really useful. The first is something I call the road less travelled. You might know the reference. It's from Robert Frost's poem. The poem is actually about an indecisive person who, confronted with a choice, and with no way to decide which option is better, knows that in the future, he will look back on his decision as the wrong one, no matter which decision he took. He will also assume, without any evidence whatsoever, that this is entirely his own fault and that most people would have chosen the other, superior route. In other words, the poem is about blaming yourself for making the wrong choice, even though there's no possible way you could have known it was the wrong choice at the time, and you actually have no evidence that it was the wrong choice to this day. Anyway, literature lesson over. That's not the way I use it to mean exactly. I just didn't want to be accused of misrepresenting one of the world's most famous poems. So returning to the actual point, I use it to mean something much simpler because Robert Frost was much smarter than I am. This is what it means for me. There's always a parallel option. All the time your players can choose to follow the main plot, or they can decide to move in a different direction and do something else. They'll insist on that flexibility anyway, no matter what you do. So you might as well lean into it. And you need to create, therefore, a parallel narrative that has no importance or meaning whatsoever for the main plot. But the players can go and do it whenever they want. It adds a great deal of depth to the universe, like a texture or background that exists everywhere, but you don't need to create individually for each new place the party visits. Now, I'm very lucky in this regard because my current campaign My players enthusiastically build these entirely on their own as part of the role-playing they enjoy. They go off on these diversions literally just on their own, no prompting from me whatsoever. I really had to do very little, but I'm not above taking credit for it. So as Traveller is my main game, let me give you the sort of classic example. Trading. It's actually just as viable in D&D and most other games. It's like a mini game that the characters can play whenever they want. And all you have to do is provide an occasional NPC or a location, and they can be pretty generic. There are other similar options. Give them some sightseeing to do, so they can travel around the universe looking for the local equivalent of the 7 wonders of the world, for example. Give them a side quest that has a long story, like finding the family of a friendly character who got separated. You know, this kind of thing. And here's where the Frost thing pays off. If they got into that side quest, they'll start to feel like they're missing out if they don't follow it for a while. But they'll also know that when the chips are down, it's time to hit the main plot hard and ignore any of these trivial distractions. I think they're very useful. I think they can add a lot, actually, to the depth that your characters have, and therefore the depth your players will enjoy. And believe it or not, that leaves me with just one remaining trick up my sleeve. And it's not exactly what you think. It's called mapping. And I'm a big believer in mapping. In my head, that probably sounded more momentous. But bear with me, though, because I'm not actually talking about location maps that the players can move across, you know, battle maps, combat maps, the layout of a bar or a hotel or a house. I'm actually talking about something a little bit different. When I want to think about how I'll represent the world to my players, I need a map. It can be a very simple one or quite complex, but there are many things you can only grasp once you have a sense of where things are. Now, cartographers, that is, people who make maps, often introduce a fair amount of geography into their maps, and I think you should do the same. I'm actually the founder and so far only member of the Society for the Abolition of Geography, which seems to attract very little interest from people. I don't know why. I'm opposed to geography as a subject in schools, you see, but only because it's sort of a random assortment of bits of other subjects, a bit of physics and volcanology and meteorology and some sociology and anthropology and politics, a smidgen of biology, history, and look, I'm sure you get the point. For now, we'll use geography as I generally mean it, not the way school teachers mean it, as a way to describe all of the things that can sensibly be added to a map and make your universe more complex and more complete. So you start with a map, and you put some mountains on it, some rivers, forests, as needed. Then you put in some cities at sensible places, then dotted lines marking national boundaries or regional administrations, perhaps. You think about defending them and put in castles where you need them, or feeding them and work out where your main agriculture will go. So think about ports, shipyards, markets, and I'm sure you're following at this point. I always think it's worth doing because it immediately allows you to answer on the fly a huge number of questions you didn't know anyone was going to ask. You've got the names of major cities and an idea of how long it might take to get there. You know how close the party is to a defended border or a major trade route. You even know that the buildings in the city are likely made of stone rather than clay because, well, the city's in mountains rather than river valleys. You've got a fighting chance at the climate, which means a fighting chance at the architecture and even the type of clothing predominantly worn in the city. But best of all, you'll actually discover things yourself in the map that you didn't entirely expect. You'll be looking for a border town in the west and realise there's only one main crossing point over the river. Or you'll have drawn an isthmus that might have a fortified wall across it. Keep the map live and add anything you come up with on the spur of the moment during gameplay, because if you can fit it on the map and it makes sense there, then it makes sense in the game almost by definition. You can produce maps for your players that are based on parts of your main map, or are even complete representations of the information if you prefer. You could also let them make their own maps as they go, obviously, or make maps as props that they can find as they adventure, or purchase from a trade caravan, or a passing vendor or a market stall. Maps are a great visual aid, and that's true even if your game is almost exclusively described rather than played through as a grid on the tabletop. If you have a map and somebody asks you the question, how far are we from there, you can literally look at the map. And it's much easier than trying to plan how you're going to answer those questions in advance. Maps are in fact awesome. It's a thing I believe in. And you might find you love them too, if you haven't done this before. It's very, very clever stuff, maps. I wish I'd invented them. I imagine the royalties would be brilliant. And for now, at least, that's it for the GMs Back Pocket. Because I've essentially covered all the things I use to keep the game lively and give it depth as the players randomly bounce from one catastrophe to the next. I've also covered the things that I use to make it appear that the game has depth, without actually having to give it any. All of those things are fairly easy to do. They're mostly reusable, and help you avoid forcing your players down a particular path, which is an easy trap to fall into if you don't have some alternatives ready to go. And I promise you, nobody ever has all of the required alternatives ready to go. No matter how prepared you think you are, your players will mess you about. They will change on the spur of the moment to something you never thought would happen. So that's it for GM's Back Pocket, Part 3 and the entire series. Moving on. Yes, this is the third and final part. Again, we're doing a lot of final parts tonight for some reason. I don't know exactly why. This is the third and final part of RPG storytelling, which is... It wasn't exactly how I intended it to go when I started, but it's turned into kind of the theory part of how to write adventures and campaigns. And this is the last of those bits. Before we start looking at some examples of how to write a good framework narrative. So, before we press on, a quick recap. There are 5 steps in a traditional story. Meet, derail, complicate, resolve, and aftermath. Because you're not in control of the actual narrative, merely the setting and the wrapper for one, you need to make sure that everything has multiple outcomes. You don't need to provide an actual route through that the players can follow, but you need the outcomes arranged to appropriately reward the players based on how well they plan or how well they roll. Believe it or not, that's basically what I covered in the first two parts. I mean, I did it with some maths and, a bit more words. Quite a lot more words. But that's basically the first two parts. So now we're going to cover the big news about writing for tabletop RPGs. You see, there are two things that differentiate RPG storytelling from, say, a movie or a novel. The minor and trivial and unimportant one is that there's almost no first or third act. So the derailing event might be barely noticed. The meat of the aftermath could easily be a monologue, just delivered by the GM at the end. In other words, almost everything is in the complication part of the story, with occasional bits of resolution. That's largely all you get. But that's the trivial difference. Here's the really big difference. In an RPG, the writer, and the GM by extension, isn't actually writing the story. The GM sets up the framework, but then the players, with a fair amount of help, admittedly, write the actual tale. If you remember part 1, the reason for that should be instantly obvious, but just in case, I'll tell you. It's because stories are about people, and the most important characters, the heroes, the protagonists, are under the control of the people on the other side of the table. Yes. Them. Okay, so here's where it helps a bit if you've ever tried to write a screenplay, even if you haven't succeeded very well. First-time screenwriters often spend quite a lot of time worrying about how a scene should be described, down to the colour of the lighting and the blocking angles. They worry about how shots should be chopped up to build a montage or a visual joke, and they even obsess over spelling. And then they hand their screenplay to a director, and he or she cheerfully decides how it will look, how to break the shots down, changes half the dialogue, deletes one character, adds another, even the spelling, that last bastion of control the writer theoretically has. Well, it turns out you can't tell the difference between there, and there when the lines are spoken. As you've just heard, in fact. Which of those three was the one where I said there? And which there am I asking you to find? Okay, this joke is only funny for me because I can see the script. Sorry. Screenwriters have to get used to the fact that movies are collaborative, and arguably the most important hand is the last one to have a go at the process, the editor. As the writer, you had the very first stab. It's a miracle if the finished film is even recognisable as the soaring epic you first wrote. So, being the alleged writer of an RPG is a lot like that. Someone once said that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. Well, no RPG scenario survives contact with the players. Okay, so enough messing around. Let's talk RPG storytelling, like I promised you 2 episodes ago. And that's where we'll stop for today. No, I'm kidding. Sorry, couldn't resist. That was my bad. So, this time, we're going to talk about the grand structure of an RPG adventure. This is the area that allows you to scale a story into an adventure and even into a campaign. We will eventually look at how each of the scenarios in an adventure can be individually built, but before we do that, we need to talk about Boostrophodon. We're going to imagine the theory that the story is kind of a line. For our purposes, it could run from left to right, but if you're from the Middle East, feel free to make it run from right to left. Hell, I'm not that wedded to the direction, as you'll see, because in a moment, it's going to go all Boostrophodon. If you don't already know what Boustrophodon is, that means you're never going to make it as a GM. Kidding, kidding. Almost nobody knows what it means, but we're going to do it anyway. A very simple story might just be one straight line. These are fairly typical for one-shots and basic scenarios. And even as the players assemble, players assemble, they know this is a one-shot. They know it's very quick, very simple encounter. Maybe you're having a quick combat or trying to get a complicated trap or whatever. Anyway, simple line, simple story. I'm sure you get the idea. You're pretty smart after all. Actually, to be fair, I don't literally know that as a fact. The only thing I know about you is that you have excellent taste in your viewing habits. Excellent taste. So that single line works very well for quite a lot of storytelling. Not just short stories and other very abbreviated things, but also screenplays and novels. There are stories that don't work that way, however. And one example might be things like soap operas. You might think that a soap has multiple lines, and up to a point, it does. But actually there's very little going on in parallel. The conceit of a soap opera is that things happen in the order you see them. So ultimately the story just jumps between plot lines but remains sequential. Our imaginary line would now look a bit jagged as you jump from plot line to plot line, but nothing important ever happens on a plot line while we're somewhere else. So it's really just one narrative, broken into little scenes and interspersed with the bits of parallel stories. The actual difference with soaps isn't the narrative line itself, it's the absence of a proper finale at any point. Because it's a soap, it has to keep going. So usually you get moments of melodrama, but those simply act as feeders into the next plotline. That's something that does share some commonality with RPGs, but we'll worry about that after we cope with the proper narrative form and structure. So RPGs are plotted in Boustrophodon. I mean, they're not really, but go with the imagery. Boustrophodon simply means writing left to right on one line, and then right to left on the next, and then left to right again, and so on. It's a way of saving you the enormous amount of energy and time it takes to flick your view back to the beginning of the next line, because the beginning of the next line is right underneath the end of the last line. Boustrophodon is sometimes found in some ancient languages, as people experimented with interesting ways to write things down, and like many ancient experiments, nobody does it that way anymore. Like the way ancient Greece tried democracy, discovered it didn't really work, and it's never been seen since. Never been seen since. Never. So, okay, Boustrophodon is a bit of a silly way to write text, but it's a very good way to visualise RPG narrative. And I'll explain why. Imagine we have a narrative that's a straight line, only we fold it into Boustrophodon. And yes, I'm going to keep using that word because I like it. Why do this? Well, it's just a way to see the story depicted in a simple way. The narrative follows this line, only, unlike other forms of storytelling, you don't get to tell the tale exactly the way you want, so ready for it, the Boustrophodon isn't actually the plot at all, it's just the subsequent narrative, it's the way it actually played out. The actual real narrative runs vertically, straight down the middle, top to bottom, cutting through all of those lines. All those curves and diversions are optional things that the players might need to do or might choose to do. And here's the secret, whatever they're doing at a given moment, stuff's happening without them as well. It's actually a parallel narrative, exactly the way soap operas aren't. So, at those crossover points, we would find the major events in the narrative. They're the touch points that tell the underlying story. You can't get to the next bit of the narrative without passing them. So you can think of them as the core of the plot. For reasons that will become clear, I call them gates. Gates are the moments where your story goes from complication to resolution. Each and every one of them is an opportunity for triumph or disaster. I'm so tempted to talk about Kipling right now, but I've already done Frost tonight, so it might be a bit much. The other thing to remember is that the horizontal lines can be shorter or longer depending on the choices the players make. They can shortcut those processes, take a shortcut across, do whatever they choose to do with that specific element. And that's the player's job, to actually cut their way through those bits of narrative, the actual boustrophodon bit, rather than the vertical stripe. That's why the players are there in the first place. If you try writing that bit, you'll be violating the rules laid down by the Players' Union, I'm sure, and you'll have to cross picket lines to get to your virtual tabletop. We get to the challenge, and then we create a selection of results that are accessible. We can tie some of those results to specific choices, like a piece of information that can only be gained if the players befriend a specific NPC. Or we could have a grab bag of 5 pieces of information, and the players earn a selection based on their success. Some possible routes you will perhaps plan for. Others will be things the players will do that you've no warning about. But it doesn't matter how they navigate it or how meandering their path. Eventually they find themselves on the bottom part of that segment, so to speak, and as if by magic, they zip along it to the next gate. So there are 2 things to bear in mind about gates. The first is there's always another sort of virtual scene which is playing out for the NPCs. And they're on their own missions or their own objectives. The players don't see that one happening because they're not on it, but they might hear about it later or scry onto it with magic or all sorts of things. And second, remember players do retain the right to skip the whole scene entirely if they want to. They can head straight down the straight narrative line towards the gate. And if they do that, they still have to pass the gate. And if you don't want them to skip that, you can close the gate. If the gate is closed, they might have to go back and do a bit of the scene in order to get the relevant information done to open the gate. But if they're open, however, the narrative is advanced merely by what happens at the gate. The scene was optional, but hopefully helpful, providing additional information or tools to make the gate a less daunting proposition. So the gate has 2 really important features, and this is really the bit you just have to remember from all of this. The first you already know. It might be open or it might be closed, maybe guarded by a gatekeeper of some form. But the second is an important concept in many narrative things. If you cast your mind back to the last episode, you'll remember I told you that the 3rd act is interchangeable. Actually, I think that was 2 episodes ago. You can win or lose, succeed or fail, and the story has to allow you to do that without it making no sense for the story that went before. And that's true. So each gate is a point where you can succeed or fail. Well, almost true, but it's actually even more than that. Your party can succeed or fail at any point during the individual adventures. In fact, they should be doing those things. Each adventure should be made of countless little decisions and results and victories and defeats. In reality, most of those won't be all that consequential, for the main plot at least, because not everything hinges on that same axis. But at a gate, things are different. Remember there's that virtual adventure that the rest of the universe is having while your party is having the actual adventure in your epic campaign. What you notice about gates is that both sides pass through the same gate, logically speaking. Your opponents might have faced all sorts of challenges in their own virtual adventures, much as your party has faced countless challenges in its. What makes the gate special is that the party and the opposition must both pass through the same gate and often at the same time. It's often a place where you can come in direct conflict with the opposition. But even that's not the whole story. If the party gets through first, or better, then this has a major impact on the opponents. That, at the end of the campaign, it will be the final third act and everything will be at stake. But then ultimate victory is just one encounter away, perhaps. But even earlier in the campaign, it must be important when you're at a gate. It must be consequential. So it's not just a point where the party can succeed or fail, it's a place where, if the party succeeds, their opponents fail, and if the party fails, their opponents succeed. It's an axis, a fulcrum, on which the entire narrative hinges. So here's the last thing to say about gates. As the stakes grow greater, these gates will be obvious to the players. They'll understand the importance of them before they reach them. But right at the beginning, they might not know enough of the plot to realise how important something was. A character they ignored, a side quest they skipped, a mission they failed. Now looking back, they see how important those really were. And that's essentially it for this. Now we've got the common terminology and a basic understanding of how stories are told in RPGs, and we can begin to build an adventure. And in fact, the theory stuff has become quite complicated. So I think it's going to be easier to do an example or two. Now we know the terminology I'm planning to use, and today's keyword, remember, is gates. And for purely organisational reasons, this is where I therefore end RPG storytelling, and begin a new series called RPG Adventures from Scratch, which will actually be the worked example part. And the two series are literally connected, as will become abundantly clear very soon. But as we're now doing something more practical, I'm going to put up a new title card and begin working on an example under a new title. I'm going to do something else for a bit first, to give you a few minutes to recover from all the times I said gate. But the first part of RPG Adventures from Scratch is coming up in this behind the screens, so you don't have long to wait. Last time I talked about text adventures. Text adventures were a way to allow people to play some aspect of a role-playing game, sure enough, but they weren't actually the only attempt to do that. And I'm going to explain another one of those attempts, because I enjoy my diversions, by talking about battleships. Not the game, nor the movie, the actual battleships. One of the most influential ship designs in all of human history was the battleship HMS Dreadnought. At the time she was launched, very early in the 20th century, there were lots of battleships already afloat. They were sailing majestically around the world, because back then, the way navies determined their relative strength was mainly down to how many battleships they had. One day, in 1906, the Royal Navy launched HMS Dreadnought, and overnight, every other battleship afloat became instantly obsolete. She had a large number of big guns, instead of a mixture of big and medium-sized ones, and she had steam turbine propulsion, making her faster than any other battleship. Add that to her heavy armour, and there simply wasn't a ship afloat that could realistically defeat her. Anyway, her influence in the real world can be easily identified by the simple fact that the battleships that came after HMS Dreadnought, ones built to a similar design, became known as dreadnoughts. Even more telling, because the generic term battleship applied to both the older design and the dreadnoughts, Those older designs became known as pre-dreadnoughts. I'm sure this history lesson is exactly what you were expecting when you find here, but there is a reason for this story. One of the most influential computer games ever written was called Rogue. Surprisingly few people have actually heard of it these days, but it was so influential that it, like HMS Dreadnought, spawned a huge number of imitators. And these imitators became known as roguelike games. Rogue was a game where you controlled a sprite, actually a single text character, a tiny little character on screen, and moved through a random map facing monsters. The map, the character, the monsters, everything was represented by a single text character from the ASCII set. And this meant that your little character moved around the screen and bumped into other things. Walls, quite frequently. You moved your character around, fighting any of the 26 different monsters as you descended through the dungeon in search of the Amulet of Yendor. The fact that there were 26 different monsters was not a coincidence. Monsters were represented by capital letters, and there were 26 available. So, Usborne Publishing, the greatest publishing company in the history of the universe, if you will remember from last time, was renowned for publishing these amazing practical computer books for children in the 1980s. We've already discussed my personal favourite of those books, the Adventure Programs one, that taught people how to design their own text adventures. But there was another that was almost as amazing. It was called Write Your Own Fantasy Games. Fantasy games took you through writing a roguelike game. It actually took you through writing an editor for building your game and then an engine for playing it. Something I remember I thought was amazingly sophisticated at the time and was obviously driven by the very limited memory in the microcomputers of the day. The reason, and feel free to disagree, that I think this was slightly less inspiring than the Adventure Programs book is simply because there are fewer ways to make a roguelike different. Fewer things you could do to develop a completely new game that was unlike anything that you'd seen before and unlike the one that came laid out in the book for you. But it still had the inevitable Usborne strengths. The way the game was designed was explained in great detail and with vivid pictures. The basic code in the book was elaborately explained and annotated. Rogue and its derivatives are largely forgotten now, but their legacy can be seen in countless modern games. Over time, games like Ultima and Eye of the Beholder would dramatically improve the graphics, the combat system, and introduce fully fledged character development. But even in 1980, Rogue allowed you to carry an inventory of potions and other items to make your journey more survivable. So, if you're interested in how these games were written, or even if you're interested in having a go yourself, those original books are available for free as PDFs from Usborne at usborne.com. And if you want to show them some love, and I think you could, think about buying a copy of their new Choose Your Fate style adventure book for the child in your life or the one hiding inside yourself. And next time on this sort of random history of things series, I'm going to finally stop talking about Usborne Publishing. I'm probably going to finally stop talking about Usborne Publishing. And I'm going to talk about how the various early attempts at computer RPGs slowly converged. Actually, before I go, just a weird little loop back, one of these amazing things. The Amulet of Yendor, this is the trophy you got if you completed Rogue, got its name because Yendor is Rodney spelt backwards. And the Royal Navy launched a dreadnought battleship called HMS Rodney, 20 years after HMS Dreadnought. There are some weird coincidences in life, aren't there? Welcome to the new series of RPG adventures from scratch. What I'm going to do with this part of behind the screens, is show how I build an RPG adventure, starting literally with a blank sheet of paper. And this series is a direct follow-on from the RPG storytelling series, and essentially that means it will use the same terminology. It's not essential that you start there, because hopefully the process should become clear enough anyway. But if you're interested, you know where to find them. Today we're going to cover the underlying story, the background against which the campaign takes place. And remember, this is just a specific example campaign. This isn't theory, this is an actual practical example. So quite a lot of what we're going to cover isn't actually relevant to the structure of the scenarios we're going to build. But it's important to discuss it because what this amounts to is the GM's information for the campaign. When we build individual scenarios, we'll only use the pieces of the story that are relevant, but if the GM doesn't know the whole tale, there's no way they can provide sensible answers when the players do something even slightly different from expectations. And they're players, so they will. Our adventure, just because it's not my regular beat, is going to be sort of a cyberpunk thriller tale. Fairly generic in nature, adaptable to whatever universe your cyberpunk game happens to be. The process we're going to follow is exactly the same for any RPG scenario. So you can follow the same steps to make a perfect adventure for your party to explore in any environment. In fact, if this goes well, I'll probably do one set in Greek mythology or something just to show how the same steps are used. But let's do just one to start with. All right? Now we've sort of begun from some basic concepts and built up to a massive campaign thing when we did the theory side. But we're actually going to go in reverse when we build our adventure. So, a quick user's guide to this step-by-step process. If you're writing a single encounter or a short module to be dropped into an existing campaign or a larger scale adventure, then you can essentially skip ahead, and I mean potentially a couple of weeks ahead, to the point where I discuss those parts of the process. I'm not actually telling you to stop watching, of course. I would never do that. But to provide a framework, we're going to begin with some of the grander scale stuff. And we're going to begin with this huge tale that we're going to cover. It's not that big a tale, actually, because our finished campaign is going to be short, of course, to make it easier to describe. Just 2 gates. Remember gates? Good. 2 resolution moments. It needs to have 2 so you can sort of see the difference between an intermediate one and the sort of final one. But if you added additional gates, and clearly you could, they would just be more intermediate ones rather than the very end of the tale. So we only need 2 to cover everything we need. So, anywho, we've got a setting. Vaguely. It's cyberpunk-ish. And we now need a backstory of some sort. And I'm going to tell you a tale of bioterrorism for this backstory. Much of the focus of this is going to be a corporation that we're going to call Intron. Now, we're calling them Intron because they do genetic manipulation. Intron has been looking for new markets for its skilled scientists to exploit, and they have started a project called Signagene. Now, Signagene is a system whereby genetic markers will be inserted into the genome of individuals, and these markers will code for the production of proteins in the body, like genes always do, or practically always do. And on this occasion, these genes will be able to make the body produce small proteins that will be released into the blood of anyone modified in this way. So you can do a very fast blood test to identify if someone has been modified in this way, and here's the clever part, there are essentially an infinite number of these special genes that can code for an infinite number of different small proteins. So you can get all of your employees, if you're an evil corporate, genetically altered, so their blood controls such things as their access to a building or to a computer system. Your particular combination of proteins will be specific to your contract with Intron. So one gene will no doubt identify your corporation, and another will be unique to the individual person, like a user account number or name. The scanner works, the way you test the person, by taking a sample of blood and testing it with a bunch of potential locks for your key. These are complementary proteins that will bind to your proteins, and the ones that clump together are the ones that you have. And they can be easily identified because they might, for example, fluoresce at a specific wavelength or have a specific mass attached to them. Biochemistry. It doesn't matter how that works for our purposes. Your lock protein can be whatever you need to uniquely identify the specific keys held in your blood. It's a brilliant system that will only allow a person access to sensitive information if they are appropriately genetically modified. And they are also, alive. In the sense that a living body part has to be put in the scanner, blood drawn at that moment, and tested immediately. True biometric security. What could possibly go wrong? Well, that's up to the writer, of course. But think about everything I've given you so far. Now imagine a few things that could go wrong. First, we've got a perfect, provably unique identity. So if somebody could somehow get the right genes and put them in, then they would be literally indistinguishable from the person they were imitating, at least to the security systems. That's a very powerful form of identity theft. Then, if you can make a tool that could uniquely identify someone in a little scanner, you could do the same thing for any other reason, right? How secure do you think Intron keeps their laboratory? How carefully protected are the scanners? More importantly, is there a way to use the technology for evil on a mass scale? Now, some of what I've told you so far will be for the players to learn as they go through the adventure, but now we get to the stuff that's really secret and must not be revealed until they earn it. There's a terrorist organisation opposed to the power of the corporates, and they are trying to cause a massive problem for a company they hate. It could be Intron or another company entirely, but for now, we'll assume that Intron uses their technology for their own employees and that they are the target of the terrorists. In this context, when I say terrorists, I'm referring only to the way they conduct themselves, with violence, intimidation, terror. I'm absolutely not implying that they are necessarily the bad guys in any more philosophical sense. The corporates may, in fact, be the bad guys. Probably are the bad guys. Everybody may be bad guys. It is cyberpunk, after all. So our terrorists, they call themselves Free From Fear, have managed to take on a few little pieces of Intron technology, and they are planning a very large demonstration indeed. Before the campaign starts, Free From Fear, or F3, as I'm going to call them from now on, have just carried out an audacious raid to break into a corporate Intron office. It wasn't the main HQ, just one of many smaller offices serving their customers and acting as a base for sales, marketing and technical personnel. a minor peripheral part of corporate evil. Now, among the things they stole in this raid were a selection of readers that contained the relevant locks to identify Intron employees. They're planning to manufacture these locks in large quantities by copying the proteins in the readers, but simultaneously they're planning a demonstration of their capability by introducing the protein locks into Intron employees as a weapon. So, essentially, the proteins can be introduced in a number of ways. In this case, in water. The proteins are so tiny, they can cross through the lungs if inhaled. So they're misted into an environment. If you did that, then people will breathe them in and they'll get into the blood. Now, if the locks are inhaled, they'll begin binding to the keys. So if you have the relevant key, they'll form larger and larger clumps of protein in the blood, killing the poor Intron employee because you're using the Intron lock. Anyone who's not an Intron employee won't have the Intron key in their blood and they'll be just fine. Completely safe. They aren't producing the relevant keys genetically. And remember, the interaction between the locks and keys was intended to only take place in the reader, not in the body of the person. It was supposed to be a drop of blood that would then be tested in the reader itself. So, there is a huge trade fair and conference coming up in a hotel complex. Intron employees will be there in great numbers. Introducing the spray in the air will kill only Intron people, leaving everyone else unharmed. In this way, F3 plans to demonstrate their lethal capabilities, cause loss to Intron, not only by killing some of their employees, but also proving the risks inherent in their technology, possibly tanking their share price, and maybe offering the underlying technology of how to kill these people up for sale to the highest bidder, if they can get a large enough reaction to their killing spree. So that's the background for the GM only. Now, our players effectively have two targets, just based on the plot that I've given you. They're related but independent. They've got to shut down the F3 facility that is manufacturing the protein locks and therefore making future attacks possible. But they also have to stop the terrorist attack at the convention, which can go ahead using the protein locks that they already have, that they stole in their raid. Now, at the very beginning, our player characters are recruited by Intron to investigate the break-in at their facility. Internal Intron people could theoretically be used, but Intron's kind of worked out the potential danger, and they know their own staff could easily be killed if the protein locks were unleashed upon them. It would be very dangerous potentially for Intron staff to go hunting these people, because any puff of wind could carry death in it, and only for them. So they need a group of outsiders. They need our players. So now the background is essentially written, and the campaign is going to take them through two scenarios with interlocking objectives. First, they will follow the clues to find the secret F3 facility and maybe destroy it. While there, they may learn of the planned convention attack, and it will be thwarting of that which acts as the final objective of the campaign. Of course, they might decide to take the technology for themselves and let the attack go ahead as a showcase of it. So we need to allow that, or any other strategic decision they make, to play out in the game. So that's where I'm going to call this first episode, because what I've given you here is the starting narrative that we're going to turn into an RPG campaign. And so next time I'll go through building the first of those scenarios with an appropriate gate at the end and show how it's sort of structured. Because I think you'll find that quite interesting. And again, everything I'm doing is completely generic with this series. You could follow exactly this story or any related story and break it down exactly the same way. I just needed to give you the full background for the GM's copy, and then we can see at the end how much of that actually makes it into the clues we give the players and how they learn different parts of the story as they go. So hopefully that will be fun. It's probably my fault if it isn't, so blame me. So last up tonight, the very last thing I'm going to show you. Last time, it was more than a week ago, I showed you Deep Night RPG Map, which is the external tool I use more than any other for actual graphics work, because I can't do graphics. And I can't ask someone to do graphics because the person I know who does graphics is my player, Luke. And if I ask him to do maps for me, then it will kind of give away things that I don't want him to know at the time. So I rely on things like Deep Night to actually handle the mapping and make me look vastly better than I am at this stuff. But this time I'm going to show you another tool that I use. Now, I don't use this anywhere near as much, but I think it's absolutely brilliant, and I think there is a fighting chance you will as well. It's called Dungeon Scrawl, which is both a brilliant name and quite misleading, especially when you also know about RPG Map. Because RPG Map is actually a program that fills a space with things that wouldn't appear on a map, like trees and tables and carpets and lights, while Dungeon Scrawl is actually used for making maps, or at least plans. Anyway, don't worry, I'll go back to talking about Robert Frost next time. Dungeon Scrawl is a remarkably brilliant piece of software, and if you'll bear with me, I'm going to just give you a little brief tour of it, at least as far as I know my way through. Because the simple reality is, this is an area in which I am far from expert. So, at the beginning, you get a grid. I know it's very traditional that way, but it's an excellent, excellent thing, and it's a very nice looking grid, and there are ways you can make it even nicer still. And then down the left here, you have a series of tools that you can use to build specific things. So, and I will probably get this horribly wrong, so just, bear with me and allow for the fact that I'm completely incompetent, and it is absolutely not the fault of the tool. I'm going to select an octagon for our purpose, and I'm going to draw it out over here on the map. Okay, in fact, we'll make it even bigger than that. There we go. So that's an octagon. And how cool does that look? The actual graphics, the way it's laid out, it looks brilliant. It looks like it's hand-drawn and, crafted and all sorts of things that it, isn't. Brilliant stuff. Okay, now you can create, conveniently, any angles you like. It'll do hexagons, it'll do whatever number of sides you want, including, and I have to say this is a huge advantage if you're used to RPG Map, it can even do curves. So we'll come to that in a second, but let's start by doing... That's not right, is it? Let's try this. How's that? How's this going to look? Perfect. Okay, and then let's try and put in a nice circle. Let's make it there, I think. like that. And then if we go down here, for example, we can put in a door, and then over here another door. And well, I'm sure you're seeing the point here. Essentially, you can use it to build any kind of map you want. It can be arranged any way you like, and it's fairly quick and easy to use. But actually, there's some kind of really clever stuff that they've done with it. And in case you're wondering how much use I could possibly get out of a system like this if you play Traveller, let me show you. You see, up in here, there are a whole series of what they call presets. Now, I'm not sort of going to draw these things specifically, but I'm just going to show you a few of the example presets that they have built. So you can design it like this, which looks a little bit different, like a sort of standalone castle tower or whatever. Well, that's true. And there's 3D isometric versions and all sorts of other things. But if you're interested in a science fiction game like Traveller, take a look at this. There's a preset for designing multiple layers which allow you to put a sort of outline shape based below it, and then over it the interior structure of your starship. And that's pretty good, actually. But there are other things you can do. You see, once you've decided on your preset, you can also decide on your style. You can choose basically a colour scheme, and there's a lovely classic one here for Dungeons and Dragons. If you remember the original Dungeons and Dragons modules with their pale blue and white plans, you can do it exactly in that style, which I think is fantastic. It's a real treat to be able to recreate those things for pure nostalgia reasons. But imagine, for the sake of argument, you actually were applying a spaceship design. Now, it's entirely possible I'm alone in this, but I think that looks absolutely awesome. Just tremendously cool as a graphic. And it's just applying a preset to an existing design. So theoretically, you could say, no, actually, I want this design in classic Dungeons and Dragons mode. Like that. Which, let's face it, is weird. But kind of fun. Or you could preset it to make it look like it's all supposed to be tunnels. Like that. Which does have the slightly unfortunate side effect of making your spaceship look furry. Which I think is a weakness. But the basics of it are intended to be entirely flexible, and you can add in your own preset designs, and you can build your own layers, and you can make it as complicated and sophisticated as you want. And seriously, I think it is capable of producing these amazing printed maps, and particularly if you're playing a less science fiction oriented one and you actually want furry spaceships, then this kind of thing can really provide the most amazing maps and plans that look like they were hand drawn on a scroll of paper, and that it is only through the application of a quill to vellum that you could produce anything like this. And yet, it's just a web page. So, to put it very simply, I'll just bring you back to this so you can see the URL. The site is dungeonscrawl.com. I think it's absolutely wonderful, and it is such a beautiful, beautiful thing that even I can do with my complete absence of artistic talent. And I'm wondering, is there a level of artistic talent that is less than zero? Is it possible to be negatively talented in something? Because clearly that is something I have managed to achieve. And the two tools I've talked about over this episode and the last one, RPG Map and Dungeon Scroll, they are tools that make me look vaguely competent when I'm really, really not. I'm not exaggerating here. So I think it actually might really be possible for anybody to make their maps and their designs look much better using that. And once again, of course, if you've got a virtual tabletop that you play on, whether you designed one from scratch, like I did for us, or whether you use a more commonly available commercial one, you can just import the graphic into that and use it as a battle map as well, obviously. But I think this one in particular makes very, very cool looking handouts and props, as well as being a useful mapping surface for gameplay. And that is where I will end tonight's episode of Behind the Screens. Partly because after I finish these, Luke always has to eventually chop them up into VOD segments, and apparently this is a non-trivial process. And he keeps telling me, I'm glad there were only 4 sections or 5 sections or whatever, and it didn't run to 8. So I'm feeling guilty enough about that I'm going to call it now. And we'll be back in a few weeks, I'm sure, to do at least the next part of the sort of gaming history series and the RPG Adventures from Scratch series, because I think actual content will really start to appear in episode 2 of that. Just a reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at Boys Baltic. If you enjoy the stream on Twitch, probably not for this perhaps, but for our gaming sessions and everything, please do think about subscribing. Subscribers get all sorts of cool things, and some of them are even physical cool things. And I got my first pack of those cool things when I hit my 3-month subscription, and they are very, very fun. We are right at the back end of our Summer of Love, remember. We've still got a few things to go for that. So the next thing we're planning to stream is Those Dark Places on Thursday night UK time at 11 o'clock. And then you can join us every Friday night at 10:30 UK time for our ongoing Traveller campaign. And closer we are getting to long games of space cricket, because space cricket is a thing that we absolutely need to do. So thank you very much. Once again, any feedback you have, of course, I'd love to hear. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope I didn't ramble on so long that you got bored to tears. And I'll see you next time. If I don't see you on Thursday or Friday or any other Friday or Thursday going forward, because we pretty much stream Thursdays and Fridays fairly consistently. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and good night.